We are an organization that has a faith base, as our name would suggest. We operate on Jewish principles, but all of our work is in the non-Jewish world, which means that on a regular basis we are interacting with Muslim and Christian individuals, and sometimes with Muslim and Christian and Hindu organizations in the rest of the world. So the notion of actually being part of a group in this country that would look at some of the complexity of faith-based issues around the world as we bring people more in contact with each other. It just seemed like maybe we would have something to contribute to the discussion, and also that we would have something to learn. I would say in much of the last decade, various players and entities in the world have been trying to respond to not the debate, is globalization good or bad, but globalization is here, so what more do we need to understand about how parties and players work with each other? And this is a particular lens on that question, and I think it was one probably not central to the work we do here, but in many other people's minds begging to be moved forward. And I also think that the election of a new president in this country, somewhat sensitive on some of these issues, is, I assume, what led the Chicago Council and what led then many of us that were asked to participate with them in an effort to try to shape some new thinking on this issue. We mostly all think of the world in terms of countries. And sometimes we think about country collaboration, sometimes we think about country conflicts, but we mostly think still, I think regrettably in the 21st century, about countries. And it should be more obvious and more integrated into our thinking that it is, that people, of course, identify themselves not just as a Kenyan or a Peruvian or a Cambodian, but in many, many other ways, and that one of those ways is people identifying themselves in terms of the faith in which they were raised or the faith in which they are attached to, and that there are then all of these issues of faith which specifically cross national boundaries, and that if you're really looking at understanding the world, that has to be as strong a feature in your thinking as many others. I just think that the report suggests to political leaders and diplomats, and also to those of us who work at a more non-governmental, less political level, that you have to take all these things into account all the time. And I think there's a particular lesson in the report for the United States, which is pertinent inside our borders as well as internationally, which is don't allow the very proud position that we have that separates church and state, something that I'm very much a supporter of. We don't have a state religion, and we try to say that matters of religion are separate from matters of state. But don't allow that division, which has many positive aspects, to blind you to understanding that people also think of themselves in terms of their faith-based adherence, and you need to understand the complexity that that adds to the situation. You'll find all kinds of Americans who will, sometimes in the middle of an argument, like, I have freedom of speech, I can say whatever I want. That's great, because it's like so ingrained in our national thinking, and it is, for me, a hugely important issue. But then you discover, well, wait a minute, when you get into the complexity of the world, you have to think a little bit about freedom of speech. So you have the great, Supreme Court ruling it doesn't extend to yelling fire in a crowded theater. I mean, I actually remember in probably junior high school when I learned that, was like, okay, so you have to think about, so I just think similarly, you can sort of champion separation of church and state, and then you just have to realize, wait a minute, there are places where it's much more complex than that. So maybe it's obvious, but I think if you look at almost any sort of thing we know we believe in, it is on the one hand something we know we believe in, and it's a good belief very often, but it plays out with more complexity than the shorthand version of it, and those of us who are trying to work in the world, and particularly those of us who are trying to make change in the world, have to become increasingly aware of complexity.